My name is Troy Whitaker, and I am a principal architect with ITS Partners. And today our webinar is going to be on demystifying licensing for System Center, SQL, and Windows Server. First, a little bit about ITS Partners. If you don't know who we are based in Grand Rapids, Michigan. We are focused exclusively on endpoint management. Of course, complementary things like mobility and security are a big part of our approach. Again, we're an engineering-centric company, and what that means is we kind of lead our business approach with engineering in mind. I think that leads to a little bit higher level of technical accreditation and engineering excellence, and that's obviously the culture that we try to cultivate. I think we offer, a unique perspective on IT maturity and processes, and that leads to things like automation and becoming more mature in your IT organization. Those are certainly things that we like to keep an eye on and help move our customers toward. Important detail for today's webcast: we are a Microsoft certified partner, and we hold several competencies applicable to this webinar today. We are certified for devices and deployment, management, virtualization, software licensing, and server management. And so we'll touch on all of those areas during today's talk. We are also a Semantic National Partner and Platinum Partner, and that's a very important relationship for us and leads us down the path to a great security offering, something that really complements our work in endpoint management, and we always like to mention that. And then finally, we have 13 or more years of proven success and trusted partnerships. We have a lot of delighted customers, and we certainly value them and like to keep moving forward and gaining more and more happy customers. So today we're going to be talking about three topics primarily. Those will be System Center 2012, SQL Server 2012, and Windows Server 2012. But before we get into the product-specific licensing topics, I want to talk a little bit about process here. This quote up on this slide, I have no idea how the licensing for this product works. I think I've heard that from every customer I've ever encountered. I know I certainly used to say it occasionally as a customer. And this really stems from the complexity of today's licensing agreements, the complexity of products and how they integrate with each other, and then layered on top of that what we would call umbrella contracts or agreements that can really drive decision-making and how licensing really works in your organization. So today I'm going to talk about a four-part process real quickly before we get into the specifics on System Center, SQL, and Windows Server, just to help give you a level set and a basis of understanding of how we approach demystifying licensing. First, inventory, right? A very important component of any endpoint management operation. You need to understand where software is installed, how it's being used, and whether or not it's being used. There are a few things that we can share with you that help you execute on that inventory activity. One, you want to leverage an endpoint management tool. So hopefully you have an enterprise class endpoint management tool installed. You have all of your managed endpoints accounted for and they're being inventoried today. If they're not, that's certainly something you can seek help with, but it's a very important component. It's really the cornerstone of any endpoint management activity, right? We need to understand what we have, where it is, and how it's being used. For those of you without an enterprise class tool, or perhaps with something that is outside the scope of those tools, you can fill gaps with free vendor-provided or community-provided tools. An example of this might be the Microsoft Baseline Security Analyzer, right? You might want to have a little bit more detailed information on which security updates you have installed, what their state may be, where you have some gaps, and how that relates to your distribution of endpoints. And there are lots of free or community-provided tools that can help fill some of those gaps for you. Always keep in mind that the Windows registry has a lot of information in it. A lot of applications will register in there, and typically even you can extract product keys from there. So if you need to track down where a particular application was installed from, or by a specific department, or maybe even a specific technician, if you have an assignment to a product key, a lot of times we can extract that information right out of the registry for you. Keeping with our theme of heterogeneous environments and cross-platform support, Mac OS X clients present a special challenge. That's something that can be overcome, certainly. Again, your enterprise class endpoint management tool likely has some of this functionality. The gaps can be filled by customized solutions or even community tools. But again, you need to be aware that you can't inventory Mac clients the same way that you inventory Windows machines. You can certainly consolidate all of that inventory into a CMDB, but you need to make sure that you account for the variance in the operating systems and the way that they present inventory information. And that really leads me to the most important point on this slide, which is ensure that that data goes into something that can be used. A CMDB, perhaps in an SQL database is really the best place to keep that data. You probably have one or more tools that can leverage that CMDB. And again, as long as you have it into a format that can be extracted easily, like SQL, it's very simple to go in and write reports and extract the information that you need. And then, you may need help with that. If you have an internal DBA team, perhaps you contract with a service provider, or you need to seek assistance with that with somebody who's very familiar with SQL database structure and how to extract information from your particular product's data store or CMDB. There are a lot of resources out there to help you with that. The second component of this four-part process is validation, and that's very important, right? What good is the data if it's not true and accurate? And one thing that I always like to tell customers is accuracy and compliance are not the same thing. You need to achieve both to trust your inventory and the methodology that was used to collect it. So accuracy is good because we can monitor compliance for collection of inventory and whether or not an endpoint management agent that's collecting it is healthy. But compliance is really the second piece of that isn't handled very well by most tools in an automated fashion. And that really comes down to a human process at this point. You need to be able to ensure that you are using the correct amount of licenses, the correct type of licenses, and that you're using those licenses on the correct type of endpoint or those that the license is valid for. There are some IT automation products, specifically Microsoft's Orchestrator, integrated with both Configuration Manager and Service Manager, can help with this process and automating that and ensuring automated compliance and delivering that information is on a subscription basis. And again, the more mature your IT organization is, and the more integrated your endpoint management, service management tools are, the quicker you're going to get to that automation phase. And again, just make sure that you have an idea of what's really out there, right? What exists in the physical world, what exists in the digital world. You need to have those inventories available so that you can validate your compliance figures and ensure that those are complete, true, and accurate. So the third step in our process here is around analyzing. One, the collected inventory, two, the validation steps that have been taken, and then really seeing where your current state is. And that really leads to the question of how can I save some money with this process? Well, one, you want to determine what's not being used but is installed. So perhaps you can recover or harvest those software licenses. On that same theme, software that's infrequently used, right? You may want to recover those licenses. Possibly it could be replaced by a free alternative or maybe even a web-based alternative. A lot of vendors are providing free versions of functional software in a web format today that can be used on an as-needed basis. Some of them require a subscription, but there are a lot of low-cost or free alternatives out there that can replace installed software. Next, there are some pieces of software that are commonly used, but they might be able to be provided in a different license type. A practical example of this would be if you've deployed, Acrobat Pro to 100% of your environment, and through some monitoring or compliance activity, you discover that 99% of your users are using Acrobat Pro to read PDFs but not write PDFs. There's a huge opportunity for savings in there because you can convert those Acrobat Pro installs to Acrobat Reader, which is a free edition, and then still satisfy the end user expectation to be able to open and read PDFs without providing them a license for a full write application that they're not even using. And then finally, look at consolidating applications, especially into virtualized environments. And that could be anything from VDI to a terminal services environment to actually application virtualization, still delivered to your endpoints, but again, providing them in an environment that can be quickly recalled, harvested, or revoked, and also what we like to call real-time licensing compliance monitoring. Typically, most application virtualization solutions can give you a real-time view of software that's being used, as well as some metrics over time on what the trends are going to be with your applications that you're deploying. And then finally, the virtualization train drives right into the cloud, which you've heard, I'm sure, from a lot of sales folks. And the idea there is that there are probably some bundled cloud services that can provide the applications that you need, but in a on-demand service that doesn't require deployment and management in your on-premise environment. And that's not necessarily a direct cost savings, but it can definitely save workload and time and frustration. So then finally, before we get into our specific topics today, the last phase of this process is taking action, right? We've done a lot up to this point. We've inventoried our software, we've validated that inventory, we've analyzed our current state and probably designated some actions we want to take. Now we have to go do it. Well, that really is going to rely on an endpoint management tool. So you're going to need an actor in your environment. If you're managing your endpoints with something like Microsoft System Center Configuration Manager, you have all of those tools right in front of you. It's just understanding how to leverage them. Especially with the 2012 release, you might want to look at doing user-centric application deployment versus software package deployment, which I think will get you to that state of being a little bit more trim on your software licensing consumption. You want to prioritize your remediation based on how much money you can save. In your company, if you are able to achieve savings of a large amount in a short term, that's always better than a small amount over a long term. So be cognizant of that. You also want to consider your audit risk, especially depending on your relationship with your various vendors and what the implementation state is, right? If you have something that's installed everywhere and it's very lightly used, it may be a little bit more work up front to try and remediate that and harvest licenses, but the benefit that you'll get out of that will be quite big. So it's always good to consider those three factors when you're prioritizing your next steps. And then finally, it may be okay to leave some applications installed. If a license expires, not every vendor requires you to uninstall the software. It can be in an unused or unactivated state. So you need to talk directly to your software vendor or the license grantor. I know of a few examples. I won't mention those on the webinar today. But again, be familiar with all of your software license agreements and understand when you can leave bits behind to make those remediation steps a little bit quicker. So let's get into the products that we said we'd talk about today. First, I have a few disclaimers here, and it's very important, right? This information is based on our internal analysis. Licensing agreements and software licenses are very complex instruments. They are not the same for every customer. So what we are offering today is our view based on what we have available. We cannot guarantee any cost figures that we show today, and we cannot guarantee any license or agreement terms. When it comes down to it, your account team from Microsoft is really best equipped to address any licensing questions that you have. We won't be able to advise you on your current state or what you should do next. We can certainly help you with that process from an implementation perspective in conjunction with your Microsoft account team, but they're really the right people to talk to about specific questions relevant to your environment or your implementation. And again, every environment is unique. Every licensing agreement is unique. They're all a snowflake. So please don't think that any of this will translate directly to your environment. But this information should be helpful if you are in negotiation for an agreement or you're trying to gain an understanding of what you have actually licensed. So let's move on and talk about that a little bit. I want to level set here again, and this is an important term. You may have heard private cloud bandied about quite a bit by folks from Microsoft or other folks out there in the partner community. What does that really mean, and how do we understand it? Well, I think it's a very simple equation. It's the combination of System Center 2012 and Windows Server 2012. And whether those elements are on-premise entirely or in the cloud entirely or in a hybrid model, most customers will be comfortable and be pursuing a private cloud strategy, and that really just means it's your data center on-premise with your Windows Server infrastructure and then whatever you're using to manage that infrastructure. So let's talk a little bit about System Center 2012. There have been some significant changes in the 2012 release around licensing. There are only 5 SKUs in the 2012 release, and that revolves around 5 components, 2 of which are relevant for server management and 3 which are relevant to client management. As you can see on this slide, there are only 2 additions for server management. You have standard and data center. I'm going to talk quite a bit about what those differences are. And then on the client side, you have basically three additions: Configuration Manager, Endpoint Protection, and then the Client Management Suite. Those are additive products, meaning you bundle them up together to get the functionality of the sum of all of those parts. And I'll talk a little bit about what that will look like in your environment, how that relates to your enterprise or campus license agreement, and specifically your core Cal suite or your enterprise Cal suite. The really important points about the licensing changes are, first and foremost, you only pay for managed clients in System Center 2012. So you do not need to calculate your total endpoint community and then pay for licensing against that. You are only going to pay to manage those clients that you want to manage. Now, you will need to account for unmanaged systems in your true-ups and your enterprise agreement negotiations. I'm sure your account team will ask you why you don't want to manage those endpoints, and they will be monitoring that. However, you only have to pay for what you're truly going to manage. The other benefit that I think is important is software assurance is now included. So no more buying some licenses and then finding out when a new release comes out that you are not entitled to it because you don't have SA. So SA is now included in all of the licenses for System Center 2012 by default, and they cannot be decoupled. So if you buy or you upgrade or migrate your licenses to System Center 2012, you will have software assurance. And then finally, as always, there are no additional costs for the management server software or the supporting SQL technology. So this is an important advantage for a System Center implementation, that SQL technology is included. I will be clear that those are SQL Server standard licenses. The only time which you would require an enterprise SQL license in a configuration manager infrastructure would be for a central administration site. And if you are in an environment large enough to warrant a hierarchy, I think that enterprise cost could be consumed pretty easily. So let's dive in and talk about servers for a little bit here. As I indicated, there are two editions, Data Center and Standard. Both of those editions contain the exact same components and support the same workloads. So as you can see on the right side of this slide, there are several components. Two of those are new for 2012, and that's App Controller and Endpoint Protection. But again, regardless of which edition you buy, you are going to get all components and have the capability for all of those workloads. Relative to that point, you cannot purchase these components individually. So there are far fewer SKUs in 2012 versus 2007. And again, you're buying a suite, and they do make that fairly cost effective, but you need to understand that there's no piecemeal anymore, and you're getting all or you're getting none. What's nice about that is the model is consistent across both editions. You are buying licenses per operating system environment, and there are some attributes that go along with that I'll get into on the next slide. But what you need to understand are really two important takeaways from this slide. What you are doing with the System Center for Servers license is you are licensing your management servers to provide services to clients. That's half of the equation, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. The other thing you need to understand that's important is your virtualization rights can provide significant scalable value, and I'll talk about that more in detail, but what I'm saying is the larger you grow your VM infrastructure, the more value you're going to realize with a certain edition of System Center 2012. So let's change gears here and talk a little bit about System Center for Clients. So as I indicated, it's a similar licensing model. There are three products that you can purchase. One is Configuration Manager, which includes endpoint licenses or client CALs as you would know them for the Configuration Manager and VMM components. You can also add System Center 2012 Endpoint Protection. Now, both of those are included in a core CAL suite if you have an existing enterprise agreement, so you'll already have those licenses for your client CALs. If you do intend to deploy and utilize the other components, Data Protection Manager, Ops Manager, Orchestrator, and Service Manager, then you will need to upgrade to an enterprise CAL suite or purchase the Client Management Suite client CAL separately. In almost any scenario, it's probably more cost-effective to just upgrade to the Enterprise CAL Suite. But if you're currently in an enterprise or campus license agreement, or you're in process of negotiating one, this is an important thing to understand. You can deploy those components from the server management perspective, but let's say you wanted to use Orchestrator to automate some self-service for an application install with a nice web front end. You would need client CALs for Orchestrator to do that if there's any integration with a Service Manager connector. or perhaps Data Protection Manager if you're doing self-service, data or file restoration for endpoints. And clients will be utilizing those components from their managed endpoints. You would need those those client CALs. And again, those are only in the Enterprise CAL suite or available as a separate purchase. And again, the important takeaway from this slide is what you're doing in this phase is you're licensing your managed endpoints to access the servers and services for which you have purchased System Center for Servers licenses. Now, one question that always gets asked is, what edition should I buy? And I want to talk about this in depth. There are really two silos here. One is an environment that has a large physical data center and they have little or no virtualization. If it's a small enterprise or mid-sized company, you may be best off with a standard edition. That comes out to $13.23 per license. That's the MSRP or the list price. So again, we're not guaranteeing these figures. Your agreement may warrant a lower or higher price. We can't predict that, but these are the published list prices. So again, you get rights to manage 2 operating system environments on-premise or 2 in a cloud. And if you look at the Data Center Edition, that's really intended for heavily virtualized environments or possibly environments that are moving in that direction. And I'll talk a little bit about what that means in the next slide. Now, what you get with the Data Center Edition is unlimited virtualization rights. So that becomes very cost effective as you increase your VM density, whether that's on-premise or in a public cloud. That license is a little bit more expensive at $3,615. And again, both editions cover up to 2 physical processors. And I'll explain a little bit about that math as we move into the next slide here. So it seems like a fairly large price delta at face value, but where you'll realize more savings as you increase your virtual machine density. And then the Data Center Edition license becomes of a lot better value. So let's look at a practical example of what I'm talking about here. So on the left-hand side, we're going to look at what would be required on a standard edition license, and on the right-hand side, we're going to look at what is required on a Data Center Edition license. And I have 3 examples. Let's assume that this is what my data center consists of. I have one physical server that has a single CPU. I have another physical server that's running Hyper-V that has 4 CPUs and 8 guest VMs. And then I have a hypervisor host out there that has 4 physical CPUs and it actually has 12 guest VMs running on it. So not a very dense environment, but a good mid-sized practical example here. So if we look, what's going to happen here is we try to license each edition. First, for that physical server with 1 CPU, although my license covers 2 CPUs, 2 physical processors, I cannot split those across chassis. So I must buy 1 license for that server with 1 CPU. If that server had 2 CPUs, it would still be 1 license, but again, I can't cross a physical box with 1 single license. So I need to account for that one physical processor server with 1 license, which actually grants me 2 licenses. If I had 2 servers with 1 CPU each, I would need to buy 2 licenses. And so that's why physical infrastructure is not very cost effective going forward. In my next example, my physical server with 4 CPUs, my license will cover 2 physical processors per license. So in this example, I would need to double my investment, and I would buy 2 licenses of the standard edition, increasing my cost to $2,646. Now again, I have rights to manage certain levels of virtualization in there. So I may need more or fewer licenses depending on what I'm doing with managing those virtual instances. But in this example, we're just going to assume we're licensing the physical server. And then that brings me to my next part of the infrastructure, which is my hypervisor host. Now I have 4 4 physical CPUs here, and then 12 guest virtual machines. Now in this example, I would actually need 6 licenses of the standard edition because each one only grants me 2 physical processors. However, I am limited on the number of virtual machines or operating system environments that I can cover. So since there are 12 guest VMs that I want to manage here, and I can only get 2 OSEs per standard edition license, I actually need to buy 6 licenses of standard edition to cover this part of the infrastructure. And that brings my cost up to almost $8,000. Now let's look at what happens when we do that with the Data Center Edition. So for my physical server with one physical processor, again, my initial cost is higher at $3,615 because, again, that license covers only 2 physical processors, and I have one on the box, and I can't split that across 2 physical servers, so I still need one license. We look at the next example, same rule applies. I have 4 physical CPUs, and in this middle example, I'm not licensing the guest VMs. I'm just licensing the physical instance. So again, I need 2 licenses, which doubles my cost to $7,230. But now let's look what happens when I try to license that hypervisor host with all of its guest VMs. Because I only have 4 physical processors, I only need 2 licenses. And the real difference between the data center and the standard edition is I get unlimited on-premise virtualization rights. So it wouldn't matter if I had 2 or 50 VMs on this hypervisor host, I still only need the 2 licenses. So once we start to really increase that VM density and we're managing those VMs, the data center license becomes much more cost effective, and it's actually cheaper than the equivalent of the standard edition for this part of the infrastructure. So hopefully that illustrates the difference between the two. So just keep in mind that there's always a 2 physical processor limit per license. There are differences in the virtualization rights and the number of operating system environments that you can manage, and there is a clear distinction between on-premise and cloud-hosted, and those attributes are per each edition. So standard has a different entitlement for virtualization in cloud than does data center. I think really the takeaway from this slide is if you have a high VM density now or you're moving in that direction, the data center license, although more of an initial upfront environment investment, is probably more cost effective for you in the long run. And really that leads me to the point that Hyper-V and System Center 2012 are very cost effective as the VM density in your environment increases. Hyper-V Server 2012 is actually a free product, just like the competitive solution. So if you wanted to put in a very dense Hyper-V infrastructure and then manage that with System Center 2012, it would be an extremely cost-effective solution. And as you increase that VM density, your cost does not go up. It actually stays flat and will probably be much cheaper than the equivalent implementation with a standard edition license. So let's just review some key takeaways from this webinar. It's very important that you know whether or not you have a core CAL or an enterprise CAL suite in your existing or you're negotiating enterprise or campus license agreement, because this will significantly impact your capital expenditures if you decide to implement something like the entire System Center 2012 suite. So you need to understand which CAL suite you have. You need to understand that you can leverage your existing CAL suites in your EA or your CLA. So when you're looking at proposing an implementation internally or externally, understand that your client CALs may already be covered by that EA. So that's a very important component of the pricing structure. And anytime we can say this is already paid for is an easy way to get a project approved. If you don't have an agreement, you might want to consider something called the Core Infrastructure Suite offering. This bundles together Windows Server and System Center, so it's basically delivering you a private cloud license in a bundled and discounted fashion, and your Microsoft account team can speak to that specifically and tell you what might be available to you at what cost level. And then, you need to move towards virtualization. Most data centers are moving this way anyways. There are cost savings to ongoing management. There are cost savings for power and maintenance. And there are going to be significant cost savings in your licensing, especially if you standardize on Microsoft's Hyper-V technology. The key part of that sentence is the higher VM density is not going to raise your costs. It's probably going to stay flat, and it's most certainly going to be cheaper than the competitive solution at that level of density. And another thing that I find that a lot of folks aren't aware of is VDI is possible with Microsoft technology. Hyper-V Server, Windows Server, and System Center can be combined to deliver a usable VDI solution for your clients or your managed endpoints. And so please, ask for more information about that, either from ITS or from your Microsoft account team, and we can come together to help craft you a solution for that. And then finally, I do want to mention, the Microsoft Online services are a great complement to what you may be doing in your private cloud or your on-premise data center today. Azure can provide some great capability for infrastructure as a service, data as a service, storage, or cloud-hosted VMs. and Windows Intune is a great product that I like to describe it as Internet client management from the internet. It's fully integrated with Configuration Manager 2012, and so you can have on-premise centralized management of endpoints that are out there on the internet roaming around, and really increase your manageability and compliance for those endpoints with a nice online subscription service that integrates with your on-premise management solution. So I've done a lot of talking today. I'll wrap this up with a little quote about ITS here, right? This is what we do. We do endpoint management, we automate, and we do provide security solutions. We like to look at the business processes as a whole, your IT processes, your IT maturity, and we want to help you deliver value to the business. There's a little bit more information on this page. You can hit ITS Partners on the web at itsdelivers.com. There's a specific URL there for our Microsoft consulting practice. There's a link there for our contact information and, of course, our phone number. So with that, we appreciate your time and attention today. We certainly appreciate you as a customer or potential customer. If there's anything we can do to help you out, clarify anything, help you automate some processes, or increase the manageability of your infrastructure, give us a call or give us a shout on the website today. Again, appreciate your time. Thank you. Have a great day.